I'm Jewell Sanders, 32, and I thought I'd finally found peace after years of walking on eggshells around my mother-in-law, Diane, when I held my newborn daughter for the first time. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine. I felt a surge of protective love I'd never experienced before. But that moment of pure joy was shattered when Diane swept into the hospital room, her voice cutting through the sacred silence. "Well, I suppose you'll be naming her Diane after me," she announced, not asked. "It's tradition in this family. The firstborn daughter always carries my name." My husband, Mark, just nodded weakly from his chair, avoiding my stunned gaze. I'd spent 9 months planning, dreaming, choosing the perfect name for our daughter. But as I looked down at my baby's peaceful face, I smiled. Because what Diane didn't know was that I'd already made my choice, and I had the birth certificate to prove it. Some battles aren't won with words. Sometimes they're won with quiet determination and a pen. I should have seen it coming during our engagement. The wedding photo sitting on my nightstand now seems like evidence of a crime I didn't know was being committed, my own slow erasure. From what was supposed to be our life together, Mark had been different when we first met at a coffee shop downtown. He was confident, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about everything from books to travel plans. For 6 months, it felt like we were building something real together, but then came the day he suggested I meet his mother. "She's going to love you," he said, squeezing my hand as we walked up to Diane's pristine colonial house. "Just be yourself." But myself wasn't what Diane had in mind. Within minutes of meeting me, she was already making adjustments. My sundress was a bit casual for family dinner. My job in graphic design was nice for now, but not really a career. And my apartment across town was so far from family. The wedding planning became my first real education in Diane's methods. She didn't forbid anything outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she asked innocent questions that planted seeds of doubt. "Are you sure about that venue, dear? It's just that Aunt Margaret has such trouble with stairs." Or, "That dress is lovely, but don't you think something more traditional would photograph better for the family albums?" Mark always sided with her practical suggestions. When I tried to discuss it with him privately, he'd sigh and say, "Mom just wants everything to be perfect. She's been planning her son's wedding for years. Can't you just go along with this one thing?" Except it was never just one thing. By our wedding day, I was wearing a dress Diane had chosen, in a venue she'd suggested, with flowers she'd approved. When I looked at our wedding photos later, I barely recognized myself. I looked beautiful, yes, but like someone else's version of beautiful. Someone else's version of the perfect daughter-in-law. The pattern was established. Diane would express a preference, Mark would defer to her, and I would gradually lose pieces of myself to keep the peace. It happened so slowly, so subtly, that I didn't fully understand what was happening until I was already drowning in it. During our first year of marriage, Diane had a key to our apartment and used it liberally. She'd rearrange my kitchen to be more efficient, replace my curtains with ones that matched the neighborhood better, and leave her own family photos prominently displayed while moving mine to less visible spots. "She's just trying to help," Mark would say when I complained. You know how mothers are, but I didn't know how mothers were. My own mother had passed away when I was in college, and my relationship with Mark's family was my primary experience. With in-laws, I assumed this was normal, that my discomfort was the problem, not Diane's behavior. The breaking point should have been the heirloom necklace incident 6 months into our marriage. Diane announced that she wanted to give me her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family treasure that had been passed down for generations. I was touched by the gesture, thinking it meant acceptance, but when she fastened it around my neck at Sunday dinner, she made sure everyone heard her conditions. Now, this stays in the Sanders family, of course. When you have a daughter, she'll be the next to wear it. And if anything ever happens, well, we won't think about that. but it comes back to the family. The necklace felt like a collar. Beautiful, valuable, but ultimately a symbol of my conditional place in their world. I was acceptable as long as I played by Diane's rules, kept her son happy, and produced the next generation to continue her legacy. That night, I tried to talk to Mark about how the whole exchange had made me feel. He was getting ready for bed, barely listening as I explained my discomfort. "You're overthinking it, Jewell," he said, not even looking at me as he brushed his teeth. "Mom was being generous. The necklace has been in our family for decades." "Our family?" I asked quietly. He paused, finally meeting my eyes in the bathroom mirror. For a moment, I thought he might understand. Instead, he shrugged. "You know what? I mean, that I did know what he meant." And that was the problem. The next 3 years of our marriage became a masterclass in psychological erosion. Diane didn't attack directly. She was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, she chipped away at my confidence with the precision of a sculptor, except she was removing pieces rather than creating something beautiful. The heirloom necklace became her favorite weapon. She'd bring it up at family gatherings, always in front of others, always with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jewel looks so lovely in the family pearls, doesn't she?" Of course, they're only on loan until she gives us a granddaughter to pass them on to. The laughter that followed always felt forced, but no one ever challenged her. I stopped wearing the necklace after the first year, claiming it made me nervous to wear something so valuable. The truth was that every time I put it on, I felt like I was disappearing a little more. But Diane noticed immediately. "Not wearing the family necklace anymore, dear?" She asked at Mark's birthday dinner, her voice carrying just enough concern to sound loving to anyone not paying close attention. "I hope it's not because you don't appreciate it. These family traditions are so important to maintain." Mark jumped, and before I could respond, "She's just being careful with it, Mom. You know how responsible Jewel is." Responsible, safe, careful. These became the words that defined me in Mark's family. Never creative, never interesting, never valuable for my own qualities, just a responsible keeper of their traditions and expectations. The holidays were particularly brutal. Diane had specific visions for every celebration, and somehow my ideas never quite measured up. When I suggested hosting Thanksgiving at our apartment, she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Oh, honey, you don't have nearly enough space. And besides, the Sanders family has been gathering at the family home for 40 years. Why would we change that now?" When I offered to bring my grandmother's famous apple pie recipe, one of the few connections I had left to my own family, Diane smiled sweetly and said, "How thoughtful, but we always have the same desserts. It's tradition. Maybe you could bring dinner rolls instead." Dinner rolls. Store-bought dinner rolls, because even those came with gentle corrections about which brand the family preferred. The worst part wasn't Diane's behavior, it was Mark's increasing inability to see it. Or maybe his unwillingness to see it. When I tried to explain how isolated and controlled I felt, he'd get defensive. "She's not controlling, Jewel. She just has opinions. You're being too sensitive. My mom has been planning family events for decades. She's good at it. Why do you want to change everything? Can't you just try to get along with her?" "She's the only mother I have." That last one always stung the most, because I no longer had a mother to run to, no family home to escape to when things got difficult. I had chosen Mark and his family as my new family, but they had never truly chosen me back. The breaking point with the necklace came during our third Christmas as a married couple. I had been battling a stomach flu and missed the family Christmas Eve gathering. When I finally made it to Christmas dinner, feeling weak but trying to participate, Diane made a point of mentioning that Mark's cousin Jennifer had worn the family pearls to the previous night's celebration. "They look so beautiful on her," Diane said, passing the green bean casserole. "Jennifer has such a classic neck for pearls." And of course, she's been hoping for a daughter to pass them on too. She and David have been trying for 2 years now. The implication was clear. Jennifer would be a more suitable keeper of the family treasures. Jennifer, who had the right neck, the right priorities, and the right desperation for a daughter to continue the legacy. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried as quietly as I could, gripping the marble countertop until my knuckles turned white. When I looked at myself in Diane's perfectly lit mirror, I saw a stranger. A thin, pale woman with tired eyes and shoulders that curved inward as if trying to make herself smaller. That night, I put the necklace box on Mark's dresser. "I think your mother should give this to Jennifer," I said calmly. "She clearly thinks Jennifer would appreciate it more." Mark didn't even look up from his phone. "You're being dramatic, Jewell. Mom didn't mean anything by what she said." "Then you give it back to her?" He finally looked at me, annoyance flashing across his face. "Fine, if it's such a big deal, I'll talk to her," but he never did. The necklace box sat on his dresser for 2 weeks before I finally took it back to Diane. Myself. I walked into her pristine living room, set the box on her coffee table, and looked her directly in the eyes. "I think this belongs with the family," I said simply. For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw satisfaction flash across her face, not surprise, not disappointment, but pure satisfaction. She had won this round, and we both knew it. "Oh, Jewell," she said, reaching for the box with perfectly manicured fingers. "Are you sure? It's such an honor to wear the family pearls." "I'm sure." She smiled then, the kind of smile a chess player gives when they've just achieved checkmate. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find them." But I knew I'd never wear that necklace again. And more importantly, I was starting to realize that my place in this family was just as conditional as my right to wear their heirlooms. I was welcome as long as I stayed small, stayed quiet, and stayed grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they chose to throw my way. The real question was, how long could I keep shrinking before there was nothing left of me at all? The ultrasound photo still takes my breath away when I look at it. That first grainy image of our daughter, barely visible but absolutely real. In that moment, sitting in the doctor's office with Mark's hand squeezing mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, pure, uncomplicated joy. "There's your baby," Dr. Martinez said, pointing to what looked like a tiny bean on the screen. "Everything looks perfect for 8 weeks. Mark's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were truly partners again. We sat in the car afterward, staring at the printed photo, talking about nursery colors and baby names with the kind of excitement that makes you forget everything else exists. "I can't believe we're going to be parents," Mark whispered, tracing the outline of the baby with his finger. "I know," I said, feeling a protective surge so strong it surprised me. This tiny being was ours, not his family's. Not Diane's to control or mold. Ours. We decided to wait until the end of the first trimester to tell our families, wanting to savor the secret just a little longer. But those precious weeks of privacy were numbered. When we finally made the announcement at Sunday dinner, Diane's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She shrieked, actually shrieked, and launched herself out of her chair to embrace Mark first, then me as an afterthought. "My first grandchild," she exclaimed, already crying. "Oh, Mark, this is the most wonderful news I've been waiting for. This moment for years." The way she said, "my first grandchild," made something cold settle in my stomach. Not your first child or our newest family member, my grandchild, as if I were simply the vessel delivering her prize. "We should start planning immediately," Diane continued, already in full organizational mode. "The nursery will need to be completely redone, of course. That spare room of yours is far too small and poorly lit. You'll need proper furniture. A good crib, I know exactly where to get the best ones. And we'll need to discuss names, naturally." Mark was beaming, caught up in his mother's enthusiasm. "Mom, slow down. We just found out ourselves, but Diane was already 3 steps ahead. Nonsense, darling. These things require planning. I have so much experience with babies, and Jewell will need all the help she can get. She turned to me with what I now recognize as her predatory smile. First-time mothers always do. Over the following weeks, Diane's involvement escalated rapidly. She arrived unannounced with pregnancy books, the ones she approved of naturally. She scheduled herself to come to my next doctor's appointment, assuming she was invited. When I gently suggested that Mark and I wanted to handle the early appointments privately, she looked genuinely hurt. "Oh, Jewell, I just want to be helpful. I've been through this before, you know. I might notice something you miss." Mark immediately stepped in. "Mom, that's really thoughtful, but I think Jewell and I can handle the doctor visits." Of course, Diane said, backing down with practiced grace. "I just get so excited about grandbabies. But do promise me you'll ask if you have any questions." I have so much experience to share. The experience sharing began immediately. Diane called almost daily with advice, suggestions, and gentle corrections about everything from prenatal vitamins to maternity clothes. When I mentioned that I was considering a water birth, she laughed that dismissive laugh I'd come to dread. "Oh, honey, those trendy birth plans never work out the way you expect. Trust me, you'll want the epidural and all the medical equipment available when the time comes. Natural birth is just suffering for no reason." When I suggested we might want to find out the baby's gender, she had an opinion about that too. Surprises are so much more fun. Although, between you and me, I'm hoping for a granddaughter. Boys are wonderful, but there's something special about the bond between grandmothers and granddaughters. That's when she first mentioned it, the naming tradition. "Has Mark told you about our family naming custom?" She asked casually during one of her visits, settling into what had become her chair in our living room. "No," I said immediately. "On guard. What custom?" "Well, it's been a tradition in the Sanders family for generations. The first daughter in each generation is named after her paternal grandmother. It's a way of honoring the family line and maintaining our legacy." I felt that familiar chill, the one that came whenever Diane introduced a new tradition that somehow gave her more control. "Really? That's interesting." Mark never mentioned it. "Men don't always think about these sentimental details," she said with a wave of her hand. "But it's very important to me. My own grandmother Diane started the tradition, and I was named after her naturally. Now it would be my granddaughter's turn." The ultrasound photo on our refrigerator suddenly felt different, less like a celebration of our growing family and more like evidence in Diane's case for ownership. I found myself studying Mark's reaction to his mother's revelation, looking for some sign that he understood how presumptuous this was, but Mark just nodded thoughtfully. "I remember you mentioning that when I was younger." "That's actually a really nice tradition, Mom." "You think so?" Diane's face lit up with triumph. "I'm so glad you appreciate it, darling. Family traditions are what keep us connected across generations." That night, I brought up the naming conversation with Mark, trying to keep my voice casual. "Your mom seems pretty invested in this naming tradition," I said as we got ready for bed. "Yeah, it means a lot to her," Mark replied, not seeming to notice. My tone. "I think it would be nice to honor that, don't you? Especially if we have a girl. But don't you think the parents should choose their child's name?" Mark looked at me in the mirror, his expression genuinely confused. "Of course we'd choose. We'd be choosing to honor the family tradition. It's not like she's forcing us." Except it felt exactly like she was forcing us, and the fact that Mark couldn't see the manipulation, or chose not to see it, made everything worse. I started researching the Sanders family history that night, driven by a suspicion I couldn't shake. If this naming tradition was so important, so established, there should be evidence of it. Records, family trees, Some trace of all these Dianes stretching back through generations. What I found instead was going to change everything. Late-night research became my secret rebellion. While Mark slept peacefully beside me, I hunched over my laptop in the dim glow of the screen, diving deep into genealogy websites and family records. What started as simple curiosity about Diane's naming tradition quickly became an obsession with uncovering the truth. The Sanders family tree was surprisingly well documented online, thanks to a distant cousin who had spent years building their family history on Ancestry.com. I started with Diane herself, born Diane Patricia Morrison in 1962, and worked my way backward through the generations. The first crack in Diane's story appeared immediately. Her mother was named Helen Morrison, not Diane. I double-checked the records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data. Helen Morrison Sanders, born 1940, married Robert Sanders in 1961, gave birth to Diane Patricia Morrison Sanders in 1962. No grandmother Diane. No previous generation of Dianes at all. I kept digging, following the maternal line back further. Helen's mother was Margaret O'Brien Morrison. Margaret's mother was Catherine Walsh O'Brien. Going back 5 generations, I found Elizabeth, Mary, Rose, and Anne common names for their times, but not a single Diane among them. My hands were shaking as I printed out the family tree, highlighting each woman's name in yellow. The evidence was clear. Diane had fabricated the entire naming tradition, but why? What was the point of creating an elaborate lie about family customs that never existed? The answer came when I started researching Mark's paternal line, his father's family, the Sanders side. The pattern I found there made my stomach turn. Robert Sanders, Mark's grandfather, had been married twice. His first wife, Mary Sanders, died in 1959. They had one son together, Mark's father, David Sanders. Robert remarried Helen Morrison 2 years later, and they had Mark's Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda. But by then, David was already 18 and planning his own wedding. The real revelation came in the 1980 census records. David Sanders had married, young at 19, to a woman named Carol Ann Peterson. They had lived together for 3 years, according to the records, but there was no Mark listed as their child. I found the divorce records from 1983. Carol Ann Peterson Sanders had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and incompatible family relationships. The court documents were sealed, but the divorce was finalized with no children mentioned. David Sanders married Mark's mother, Linda Wright, just 6 months later. Mark was born in 1985. When David was 25, the pieces were falling into place. David's first wife had lasted 3 years before Diane drove her away, or before the family dynamics became unbearable, enough that she chose to leave. How many other women had come and gone from the Sanders family over the years? How many had been worn down by Diane's subtle campaign of control and manipulation? I was printing out marriage and divorce records when I found something that made my blood run cold. In the local newspaper archives, I discovered a small announcement from 1988. Linda Wright Sanders gave birth to a daughter, Amanda Rose Sanders, on March 15th, 1988. Mark had a sister he had never mentioned, who didn't appear in any family photos, who seemed to have vanished completely from the Sanders family narrative. My research led me to Amanda Rose Sanders' death certificate from 1989. She had died at 11 months old from complications related to pneumonia. But what stopped me cold was a small detail in the newspaper obituary. Amanda Rose was lovingly known as Little Diane to her grandmother, who doted on her constantly. Diane had tried to claim Mark's baby sister as her namesake, a child who lived for less than a year, whom she had apparently attempted to remake in her own image. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. Diane didn't just want control, she wanted legacy. She wanted to stamp her identity onto each new generation to ensure that her influence would ripple forward through time. The family tradition wasn't about honoring the past. It was about controlling the future. I kept researching until dawn, following every thread I could find. In the local historical society records, I found evidence of Diane's own manipulations. Within her community, she had served on the church board for 15 years, but there were multiple mentions in meeting minutes about disagreements with Mrs. Sanders regarding traditional practices, and concerns about Mrs. Sanders' interpretation of long-standing customs. Even in her church community, Diane had a reputation for inventing traditions that served her purposes. The most damning evidence came from Mark's Aunt Linda, his father's sister, not his mother, Linda. I found her contact information through Facebook and sent her a carefully worded message asking about family history. Her response came within hours, and it was explosive. I wondered when someone would finally ask about Diane's so-called traditions, Linda wrote. She's been making up family customs for 30 years. The naming thing is complete nonsense, she tried to get David to name Mark after her father, then when that didn't work, she started pushing for a granddaughter to carry her name. She drove David's first wife away with this kind of manipulation, and she's been working on Linda ever since. I stopped attending family gatherings years ago because I couldn't stand watching her rewrite our family history to suit her needs. Linda attached several family photos that Diane had never shown us, pictures of David's first wedding, of baby Amanda Rose, of family gatherings that looked relaxed and happy before Diane had gained complete control of the narrative. By the time Mark woke up, I had assembled a comprehensive file of evidence. Birth certificates, marriage records, divorce papers, newspaper articles, family photos, and testimonies from relatives who had escaped Diane's influence. The naming tradition was a complete fabrication designed to give Diane ownership over our daughter before she was even born. "Morning, babe," Mark mumbled, shuffling toward the coffee maker. "You're up early." I looked at him across our kitchen table, surrounded by printouts that proved his mother had been lying to us about something as fundamental as our family's history. He looked so trusting, so unaware of the web of manipulation he'd been raised. "And, Mark," I said carefully, "we need to talk about your family's history." I've been doing some research. The conversation that followed would test everything I thought I knew about my husband's willingness to face uncomfortable truths about the woman who had shaped his entire worldview. The evidence was damning, but would it be enough to open his eyes? Or would he find a way to explain away 30 years of documented lies, just like he explained away every other red flag his mother had raised? The baby name book became my shield and my secret weapon, hidden in plain sight on my nightstand. While Diane assumed I was dutifully preparing to honor her fabricated tradition, I was actually researching names that would carry real meaning, names that would connect my daughter to genuine family history rather than manufactured legacy. Mark's reaction to my genealogy research had been disappointingly predictable. When I showed him the evidence that Diane's naming tradition was completely invented, he spent 20 minutes finding ways to explain it away. "Maybe the records aren't complete," he said, barely glancing at the family tree I'd printed out. "You know how documentation was back, then things got lost, names got recorded differently. Mark, I found 5 generations of women in your family. Not one of them was named Diane." Well, maybe it was a tradition that skipped some generations, or maybe it was more informal than Mom remembered. I stared at him, holding the divorce records that showed his father's first wife had left after 3 years of marriage, likely due to family pressure. What about David's first marriage? "Did you know your father was married before your mother?" That gave him pause, but only briefly. "That's ancient history, Jewell. People have complicated pasts. It doesn't mean anything about Mom's family traditions." The willful blindness was breathtaking, but it also clarified something important for me. I was on my own in this battle. Mark would not be my ally in resisting his mother's manipulation. If I wanted to protect my daughter from becoming another casualty in Diane's campaign for control, I would have to do it myself. So I began my own quiet campaign. Using the baby name book as my cover, every evening I would curl up in bed with the book, letting Mark see me reading it while I actually researched names that had real significance to our families. I found beautiful names from my grandmother's Irish heritage: Siobhan, Maeve, Bridget. I discovered names from Mark's actual family history: Helen, after his real grandmother, or Margaret, after his great-grandmother who had immigrated from Scotland when Diane visited. She would always comment on my homework, still reading that. "Name book, I see," she'd say with a knowing smile. Well, I suppose it's good to look at all the options, even though we already know what the right choice is. "And just exploring possibilities," I would reply carefully, not wanting to tip my hand too early. "Of course, dear. But remember, some names have weight and meaning behind them. Family names carry legacy." The irony was suffocating. Diane lecturing me about legacy while pushing a tradition she had invented wholesale. As my pregnancy progressed, Diane's pressure intensified. She started bringing up the naming issue at every gathering, always in front of other family members, always as if it were a settled matter. "When little Diane arrives," she would say, patting my growing belly without asking permission, "she'd be the 4th generation to carry the name, such a strong family tradition." Mark's relatives would nod and smile, not knowing they were participating in Diane's historical revision. Some of them even shared memories of the family naming custom, apparently convinced by Diane's confident assertions that they remembered something that had never existed. The gaslighting was so complete, so systematic, that I began to doubt my own research. Could I have missed something? Could there be family records I hadn't found? But then I remembered Linda's message, Mark's aunt who had escaped the family dynamics years earlier. Her words kept echoing. "She's been making up family customs for 30 years. I decided to dig deeper into what our daughter's real name options could be. If Diane wanted family tradition, I would give her family tradition, just not the fake one she had manufactured. In my research, I had discovered Mark's great-great-grandmother, a remarkable woman named Eleanor May Sanders, who had raised 6 children on her own after her husband died in a mining accident. She had worked as a seamstress and somehow managed to send 3 of her children to college during the Depression. Here was a woman worth honoring, someone whose strength and independence embodied the kind of legacy I wanted to pass on to my daughter. I also found my own grandmother's middle name buried in immigration records: Esperanza, Spanish for hope. My grandmother had shortened it to Anna when she came to America, but the original name carried the story of a young woman who had traveled across an ocean to build a better life for her family. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders. It was perfect, honoring real family history from both sides, carrying stories of strong women who had overcome adversity, and completely circumventing Diane's manufactured tradition. But I kept this discovery to myself, continuing to let Diane believe that her psychological campaign was working. "Have you given any more thought to names?" she asked during a family barbecue when I was 7 months pregnant. "We're still discussing it," I said diplomatically. "Well, don't wait too long," she replied with false casualness. "You'll want to have the nursery properly decorated, and that's so much easier when you know you're having little Diane." Mark's father, David, looked up from his burger with a confused expression. "Little Diane, are you naming the baby after Mom?" "It's the family tradition," Diane said smoothly. "The first daughter in each generation carries my name." David's brow furrowed. "I don't remember that tradition, Diane. When Mark was born, we didn't—" "Well, Mark wasn't a daughter, obviously," Diane interrupted with a laugh. "The tradition is specifically for granddaughters." I watched David's face carefully. He looked genuinely puzzled. as if trying to recall a family custom that existed only in his wife's imagination. But instead of pressing the issue, he just shrugged and returned to his food. That moment crystallized everything for me. Even Mark's own father was being gaslit into accepting Diane's revised family history. The manipulation was so thorough, so consistent that she was rewriting the past in real time, and everyone was going along with it to avoid confrontation. Everyone except me. That night, I made my final decision about our daughter's name. I filled out the pre-registration paperwork for the hospital, writing Eleanor Esperanza Sanders in careful block letters. When the time came, I would have everything ready. Diane could demand and manipulate and guilt trip all she wanted, but our daughter would carry the names of women who had actually earned the honor, women whose stories deserved to be remembered and passed forward. The baby name book on my nightstand was no longer a shield. It had become evidence of my careful planning, my secret rebellion, and my determination to break the cycle of manipulation that had defined my marriage. In 3 months, Diane would learn that not every battle can be won through psychological warfare. Sometimes the quiet strength of a mother protecting her child is more powerful than years of careful manipulation. I just had to survive the next 3 months without revealing my hand. The text message from Mark's sister-in-law, Sarah, came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night when I couldn't sleep, my 8-month pregnant body refusing to find a comfortable position. The message was simple but loaded. Are you awake? I need to tell you something about Diane and baby names. Sarah was married to Mark's older brother, Tom, and I had always thought of her as firmly in Diane's camp. She laughed at all of Diane's jokes, agreed with her suggestions, and seemed to navigate the family dynamics with a kind of ease I had never managed. Getting a middle-of-the-night text from her was unexpected, to say the least. Yes, I'm awake. I texted back, what's going on? My phone rang immediately. Jewel, I'm so sorry to call this late, but I've been lying awake thinking about your baby shower last weekend, and I just can't stay quiet anymore. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, like she was afraid someone might overhear. When Diane started going on about the naming tradition and how excited she was for little Diane to arrive, I just ... I couldn't keep pretending anymore. My heart started racing. Pretending about what? The naming tradition is bullshit, Jewel. Complete bullshit. When I was pregnant with Emma 4 years ago, Diane tried the exact same thing with me. I sat up in bed as carefully as I could, trying not to wake Mark. What do you mean? Sarah's voice gained strength as she continued. She told me all about this sacred family tradition of naming the first daughter after the grandmother. She had the whole story, how it went back generations, how important it was to maintain the family legacy. She even cried when she told me about it, talking about how meaningful it would be to have little Diane carry on the tradition. But Emma isn't named Diane. No, she's not. And that's because Tom's grandmother, his dad's mother, was still alive then. She's 92 now, sharp as a tack. And when I mentioned Diane's naming tradition to her, she looked at me like I had lost my mind. I was gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles hurt. What did she say? She said, and I quote, "What tradition? That woman has been making up stories about this family since the day she married in. There's no naming tradition. She just wants to stamp her name on everything she can get her hands on." The validation was overwhelming. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't misunderstanding family dynamics or being overly sensitive. Diane was systematically lying to maintain control, and other people had noticed. Sarah, why didn't you ever say anything before? There was a long pause. Because it was easier not to. Tom and I live 3 states away. We only see Diane a few times a year. I could just smile and nod and let her think she had won without actually having to deal with the consequences. But you live here. You're dealing with this every day. And I've watched what it's been doing to you. What do you mean? Jewel, you've disappeared. The woman I met at Tom and my wedding 5 years ago was confident, funny, had opinions about things. The woman at your baby shower barely spoke above a whisper and apologized for everything. Diane has been systematically erasing you for years, and we've all just watched it happen. The truth of that hit me like a physical blow. I had been disappearing, shrinking myself down to fit into the narrow space Diane allowed me to occupy. And everyone had noticed. Tom knows what his mother's like, Sarah continued. He just learned early to keep his head down and stay out of her way. But Mark genuinely doesn't see it. He was Diane's golden child, her special project. She was more subtle with him because she needed him to believe in her version of reality. What am I supposed to do, Sarah? Mark won't hear anything against his mother. He thinks I'm being paranoid and oversensitive. You document everything. You save these text messages. You keep copies of your research. And when the time comes, you do what you need to do to protect your daughter, even if Mark doesn't understand. We talked for another hour, Sarah filling in details about family dynamics I had never fully understood. How Diane had driven away Tom's previous girlfriend by making her feel unwelcome at every family gathering. How she had criticized Sarah's parenting choices so consistently that Sarah now avoided bringing Emma to extended family events. How Mark's cousins had learned to keep their distance because Diane always found ways to create drama around their life choices. The thing about Diane, Sarah explained, is that she needs to be the center of every family story. If someone else is getting attention, she finds a way to redirect it back to herself. Your pregnancy has been killing her because it's not about her. It's about you and Mark and the baby. The naming tradition is her way of making sure she's still the most important person in the narrative. After we hung up, I lay in the dark for hours, processing everything Sarah had told me. The pattern of manipulation was even more extensive than I had realized. Diane hadn't just been controlling me. She had been controlling the entire family system for decades, carefully managing relationships and narratives to maintain her position at the center of everything. But Sarah's call had also given me something I hadn't expected, an ally, someone who understood what Diane was really doing and was willing to bear witness to it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I began communicating regularly. She shared stories about other family members who had been pushed out or manipulated. Over the years, Mark's cousin Jennifer, who had stopped attending family gatherings after Diane repeatedly criticized her career choices. His uncle Paul, who had moved across the country partly to escape Diane's judgment about his lifestyle. A whole network of family members who had learned that the price of peace was distance from Diane's sphere of influence. The thing is, Sarah told me during one of our calls, Diane isn't evil. She's not sitting around plotting ways to hurt people. She genuinely believes that she's the wise matriarch who knows what's best for everyone. That's what makes her so dangerous, she thinks. Her manipulation is love. Sarah also helped me understand Mark's psychology better. He grew up being told he was special, that he was Diane's pride and joy, that everything she did was because she loved him so much. That's a hard reality to question when you're an adult. Admitting that his mother manipulates people means admitting that he's been living in a constructed reality his whole life. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah helped me plan for the hospital. When Emma was born, Diane tried to steamroll her way into the delivery room. Sarah told me. Tom had to physically block the door while I was in labor. She threw a fit about being excluded from her granddaughter's birth, but we held firm. You're going to need to be prepared for that level of drama. She was right. As my due date approached, Diane's behavior became increasingly possessive and demanding. She called the hospital to ask about visiting policies. She announced that she would be taking a week off work to help with little Diane. She started referring to the nursery as Diane's room and talking about all the things she wanted to teach her granddaughter. But now I had Sarah in my corner, providing reality checks and encouragement. When Diane's behavior made me feel like I was losing my mind, Sarah would remind me that I wasn't imagining things, that my instincts were correct, and that protecting my daughter was worth whatever family drama might result. "You're about to become a mother," Sarah told me the week before my due date. "That changes everything. Your job isn't to keep Diane happy anymore. Your job is to protect your child from inheriting the same patterns that have been damaging this family for decades." The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time in years, I wasn't standing alone on my side. The legal documents I prepared during my final month of pregnancy felt like insurance. Policies against a storm I could see building on the horizon. While Diane ramped up her campaign of possession and Mark continued to enable her behavior, I quietly armed myself with every piece of documentation I might need to protect my daughter's identity and my own autonomy. The birth certificate pre-registration was just the beginning. I also researched hospital policies about visitors and decision-making during labor and delivery. I printed out information about parents' rights regarding newborn procedures and documentation. I even consulted with a family lawyer about what options I would have if family conflicts escalated after the birth. "You're being paranoid," Mark said when he found me reading legal websites late one night. "Mom is excited about becoming a grandmother. Why are you treating this like some kind of battle?" But it was a battle, whether Mark could see it or not. And Diane's behavior during those final weeks proved it. She began showing up at our apartment daily, always with some excuse. She brought meals that nobody asked for, rearranged our baby supplies to be more organized, and started referring to herself as Grandma Diane in every conversation, as if the repetition would somehow make her claim to our daughter's name more legitimate. "I picked up some adorable outfits for little Diane today," she announced during one visit, holding up pink dresses embroidered with the letter D. I thought she should have some special clothes for her first photos. The presumption was breathtaking. She was already shopping for a granddaughter whose name she had decided without consulting the actual parents. "Diane, we haven't decided on a name yet," I said carefully. She looked at me with that familiar expression of patient condescension. "Oh, sweetie, some decisions are already made by family tradition. You'll understand when you hold her in your arms. The name will just feel right." Mark nodded along, completely missing the manipulative subtext. "It would be nice to honor family history," he said. "Exactly," Diane beamed. "Family history is so important." What she meant was her version of family history, the fabricated narrative she had spent decades constructing. But I had my own documentation now, carefully organized in a folder hidden in my desk drawer. Birth certificates, marriage records, and genealogy charts that told the real story of the Sanders family women, none of whom had been named Diane. The pressure intensified as my due date approached. Diane started making comments about how she hoped I would be reasonable about the naming decision, how she was sure I wouldn't want to disappoint the family, and how little Diane was already such a part of everyone's expectations. She also began making plans that assumed her central role in our daughter's life. "I've already arranged to take 2 weeks off work when Diane arrives," she announced at a family dinner. "New mothers need so much help, and I have so much experience to share." "That's really generous, Mom," Mark said, "but I'm taking paternity leave. We should be okay." Diane waved away his concern. "Oh, darling, fathers are wonderful, but there's no substitute for a grandmother's wisdom. I raised 2 boys successfully. I know exactly what little Diane will need." The way she spoke about my unborn daughter as if she were already half-raised, already belonging more to Diane than to me, made my protective instincts flare. This woman was planning to take over my child's life before she was even born. Started having contractions at 38 weeks, but they stopped after a few hours. Diane was at our apartment within an hour of Mark mentioning the false alarm carrying a suitcase. I thought I should be prepared, she explained, settling into our guest room without being invited. First babies can come early and you'll need help immediately. She stayed for 3 days, taking over our kitchen, rearranging our baby supplies, again, and offering constant commentary about labor and delivery based on her own experiences 30 years earlier. When I had Mark, I was in labor for 14 hours, she told me repeatedly. But it was worth every minute when I saw his perfect little face. That's what you'll feel when you hold little Diane. All the pain will just disappear. She also started making phone calls to family members, positioning herself as the central figure in the upcoming birth. Yes, the baby should be here any day now, I heard her saying to someone. I'm staying with Mark and Jewell to help with the preparation. Little Diane is going to be so lucky to have such an involved grandmother. The constant references to little Diane felt like psychological warfare. Every time she said the name, she was reinforcing her claim, making it seem inevitable, wearing down my resistance through sheer repetition. But I had my own secret weapon now, certainty. Every document I had prepared, every conversation with Sarah, every piece of research I had compiled had strengthened my resolve. This woman had been manipulating my family for years, rewriting history to serve her own needs, and I was not going to let her do the same to my daughter. When my real labor started at 39 weeks and 2 days, I was as ready as I could be. The hospital bag was packed with copies of my pre-registration paperwork. My phone contained Sarah's number and explicit instructions about who should be called and when. Most importantly, my mind was clear about what needed to happen. It's time, I told Mark as the contractions became regular and strong. His face went pale with excitement and terror. Should I call Mom? Let's get to the hospital first, I said, buying myself a few more hours of peace. We can call family once we know how things are progressing. The drive to the hospital was surreal. Between contractions, I found myself thinking about all the battles that had led to this moment. The wedding planning that had been taken over. The holidays where my traditions were dismissed. The heirloom necklace that had become a symbol of conditional acceptance. The fake family naming tradition that Diane had constructed to control even my unborn daughter's identity. All of it had been leading to this. The moment when I would finally draw a line that could not be crossed. I love you, Mark said as we pulled into the hospital parking lot. Whatever happens, I love you and our baby. I love you too, I replied, and meant it despite everything. That's why I'm doing this. He looked confused by my phrasing, but another contraction hit before he could ask what I meant. As the wheelchair took me through the hospital doors. I felt the weight of the legal documents in my purse, the certainty of my decision, and the fierce protective love that had been growing inside me along with our daughter. Diane could manipulate and guilt trip and demand all she wanted, but she was about to learn that a mother's love is stronger than 30 years of psychological warfare. The hospital bracelet they placed around my wrists felt like armor, a simple plastic band that marked me as the patient. The mother, the person whose decisions mattered most in the sterile room that would become a battlefield. Labor progressed quickly once we arrived. The contractions that had started as uncomfortable pressure waves became consuming forces that demanded every ounce of my attention. In those moments of overwhelming intensity, I found a kind of clarity I had never experienced before. All of Diane's psychological games, all of Mark's enabling behaviors, all of the family drama that had been building for months, none of it mattered. When my body was doing the ancient work of bringing my daughter into the world. How are you feeling? Mark asked, holding my hand between contractions. Strong, I said, and for the first time in years, I truly meant it. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Patricia with kind eyes and efficient hands, reviewed my birth plan and pre-registration paperwork. I see you've already filled out the birth certificate information, she noted. That's unusual. Most parents wait until after the birth to decide on names. I'm a planner, I said simply, catching Mark's surprised look. "What name did you choose?" he asked, trying to read the paperwork over Patricia's shoulder. "It's a surprise," I said, gripping his hand as another contraction built. "You'll find out when she arrives." Mark looked confused but didn't press the issue. The contractions were coming faster now, demanding all of our attention. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "How are things progressing?" "I'm ready to come to the hospital as soon as little Diane makes her appearance." I handed the phone to Mark without responding. Let him manage his mother's expectations for once. As labor intensified, I found myself thinking about all the women in my real family history. My grandmother Esperanza, who had crossed an ocean to build a better life for her children, and Eleanor May Sanders, who had raised 6 children alone during the Depression. These were the women whose strength I was channeling, whose legacy I wanted to pass on to my daughter. "You're doing amazing," Patricia said as she checked my progress. "Baby should be here within the hour." The final stage of labor was a blur of intensity, focus, and primal determination. Mark held one hand while I gripped the bed rail with the other, breathing through contractions that felt like they might split me in half. In those moments, I wasn't thinking about Diane or family, traditions, or naming battles. I was just a woman bringing her child into the world, connected to every mother who had ever done this before me. And then, at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, our daughter arrived. The first sound she made was a strong, indignant cry that filled the delivery room. Patricia placed her on my chest, and I felt a surge of love so fierce and protective that it took my breath away. This tiny, perfect person was mine to protect, mine to name, mine to raise according to values that honored real family history rather than manufactured traditions. "She's beautiful," Mark whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She's absolutely perfect." Our daughter had dark hair like mine and Mark's brown eyes. Her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb with surprising strength, and when she looked at me, I felt like she was seeing straight into my soul. "What's her name?" Mark asked softly. I looked down at this perfect little person who had just made me a mother, who had given me the strength to finally stand up for what was right. "Eleanor Esperanza Sanders," I said clearly. "Eleanor after your great-great-grandmother who raised 6 children on her own, and Esperanza after my grandmother who came to America to build a better life for her family." Mark's face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. "Eleanor Esperanza," he repeated slowly. "It's beautiful. But Mom is expecting, your mother has been expecting a lot of things that were never going to happen." I said firmly, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "Our daughter deserves to be named after women who actually existed, who actually accomplished something worth honoring." Before Mark could respond, his phone rang. Diane's ringtone. "Don't answer it yet," I said. "Give me a few more minutes with our daughter before the circus begins." Patricia was finishing up the medical procedures, giving us space to bond as a new family. I studied Eleanor's tiny face, memorizing every detail, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settling into my bones. "She looks like you," Mark said wonderingly. "She looks like herself," I corrected. "And she's going to grow up knowing exactly who she is, not who other people want her to be." The phone rang again. This time Mark answered. "Hi, Mom. Yes, she's here. She's perfect." A pause. "Her name is Eleanor Esperanza." Another pause, longer this time. "No, Mom, I know what you're thinking, but yes, you should come to the hospital. We're in room 347. He hung up and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "She's on her way." She sounded surprised. "I'm sure she did," I said calmly, adjusting Eleanor in my arms. Diane doesn't like surprises, especially ones she can't control. "Jewell, about the name is perfect," I interrupted. "It honors real family history from both sides." Eleanor May Sanders was an amazing woman who deserves to be remembered. And my grandmother Esperanza represents hope and courage in the face of change. These are the qualities I want our daughter to carry forward. Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's sleeping face. I never knew about my great-great-grandmother. Eleanor, there's a lot about your family history that you never knew, I said gently. Because your mother has been too busy inventing new stories to preserve the real ones. The storm was coming. Diane would arrive within the hour, expecting to meet little Diane and finding Eleanor instead. The confrontation I had been preparing for would finally happen, but as I held my daughter close, feeling her warm weight against my chest, I knew I was ready. The hospital bracelet on my wrist marked me not just as a patient, but as a mother, and mothers protect their children no matter what battles they have to fight. The completed birth certificate lay on the hospital table like evidence in a trial I was finally ready to win. Patricia had helped me fill out every line with careful precision. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders, born at 3:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds, and 2 ounces, parents listed as Jewell Marie Sanders and Mark David Sanders. Official, legal, and irreversible. I had about 30 minutes of peace with my new family before the elevator doors opened and Diane's voice echoed down the hallway. She was talking to someone, probably the nurse's station in the tone she used, when she wanted to establish her importance and authority. I'm here to see my granddaughter, little Diane Sanders. She was born just a few hours ago to my son, Mark, and his wife. Mark tensed beside me. I should go talk to her, he said, starting to stand. No, I said firmly, adjusting Eleanor in my arms. Let her come here. This conversation needs to happen in front of our daughter because it's about her future, not Diane's comfort. The knock on the door was brief and perfunctory. Diane never waited for permission to enter spaces she considered herself entitled to occupy. She swept into the room like a force of nature, carrying flowers and balloons, her face already arranged in the expression of triumphant joy she wore when she felt she had won something. "Oh, my darling boy," she exclaimed, rushing to embrace. Mark first, as always. And where is my beautiful little granddaughter? Where is little Diane? She turned to me with arms extended, expecting to take the baby immediately. But when her eyes fell on the birth certificate on the table, her expression flickered with confusion. Eleanor? She read aloud, her voice sharp with disbelief. What is this paperwork? There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, I said, calmly, holding Eleanor closer. Meet your granddaughter, Eleanor Esperanza Sanders. The silence that followed was deafening. Diane's face went through a remarkable transformation, confusion giving way to anger giving way to the kind of controlled fury that had terrified me for years, but somehow felt powerless now that I was holding my daughter. Eleanor? She repeated as if the name itself was offensive. But we discussed this, Jewell. We agreed on the family tradition. Everyone is expecting little Diane. We never agreed to anything, I said, my voice steady and clear. You announced your expectations and assumed everyone would comply. But I'm her mother, and I chose to name her after women who actually existed and actually accomplished something worth honoring. Diane's mask of grandmotherly joy slipped completely. What do you mean? Women who actually existed? I exist. I'm standing right here. I'm her grandmother, and I have every right to expect. You have the right to expect respect, Diane. Don't have the right to control my daughter's identity or rewrite our family history to serve your ego. Mark looked back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, clearly struggling with loyalties he had never been forced to examine before. Jewell, let's not do this now, he said weakly. Mom just got here. Maybe we can discuss the name situation later. There is no name situation, I said firmly. Her birth certificate is filed. Her name is Eleanor Esperanza Sanders. The only discussion that needs to happen is whether your mother can accept that reality or not. Diane's Composure cracked further. This is ridiculous. The family tradition is completely fabricated, I interrupted, reaching for the folder I had prepared. I did the research, Diane. I found the genealogy records, the birth certificates, the marriage licenses. There is no naming tradition in the Sanders family. You invented it. I pulled out the family tree I had printed, highlighting every woman's name in yellow. 5 generations of Sanders women. Diane, not one of them named Diane. Your own mother was Helen. Your grandmother was Margaret. Your great-grandmother was Catherine. Should I keep going? Diane stared at the documents like they were weapons pointed at her chest. Those records could be incomplete. I also spoke to your sister-in-law, Linda. Remember her? She had some very interesting things to say about your tendency to invent family traditions when it suits your purposes. Mark was reading over the genealogy charts, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. Mom, is this true? Did you make up the naming tradition? I didn't make up anything, Diane said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Family traditions don't always appear in official records. They're passed down through stories, through understanding, through manipulation, I finished. Just like you tried to manipulate David's first wife, just like you tried to manipulate Sarah when Emma was born, just like you've been manipulating everyone in this family for decades. The room fell silent except for Eleanor's soft breathing. She was sleeping peacefully through the confrontation that was reshaping her. Family's future. Diane looked at the birth certificate again, then at Eleanor, then at Mark. I could see her, calculating, trying to find a new angle of attack, a way to regain control of the narrative. Well, she said finally, forcing her voice back to its usual sweet tone, I suppose Eleanor is a lovely name too. Very traditional. And of course, we can always call her Ellie, or maybe Ella. We'll call her Eleanor, I said firmly. That's her name, not a nickname, not a variation that makes you more comfortable. Eleanor Esperanza, named after strong women who overcame adversity to build better lives for their families. Diane's eyes flashed with something dangerous. I see. And I suppose you think I haven't built anything for my family? I suppose you think I haven't sacrificed and worked, and I think you've spent 30 years rewriting history to make yourself the center of every story, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I think you've manipulated family members, driven away people who threatened your control, and convinced yourself that your need to be important justified lying to your own son about his family's heritage. Mark was staring at his mother with an expression I had never seen before, not anger. Exactly, but something like recognition, like pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. Mom, he said slowly, did you really make up the naming tradition? Diane's face crumpled slightly, but she rallied quickly. Mark, sweetheart, you have to understand family unity requires shared values, shared traditions. I was trying to create something meaningful for our family, something that would bring us together by lying, Mark said flatly. You were trying to create unity by lying about our family history. It wasn't lying. It was lying, Mom, and it's been lying for years. The birth certificate on the table seemed to glow with official authority. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders, daughter of Jewell and Mark, granddaughter of Helen and David, great-great-granddaughter of the real Eleanor May Sanders, who had raised 6 children. Alone during the Depression, Diane looked around the room as if searching for allies, but found only her son's dawning understanding, her daughter-in-law's quiet strength, and a sleeping baby whose name would forever mark the end of her ability to control our family's narrative. The war wasn't over, but this battle was won. The handwritten letter I had prepared weeks earlier felt warm in my hands as I pulled it from Eleanor's baby book. I had written it during one of those sleepless nights when pregnancy insomnia had given way to fierce determination to document my daughter's true heritage. Now, as Diane stood in our hospital room, looking like her world had shifted off its axis. The letter would serve as my final piece of evidence. "I want to read you something," I said, unfolding the pages carefully. "This is a letter I wrote to Eleanor about why I chose her name. I thought you should hear it, Diane, since you seem so concerned about family traditions and heritage." Mark moved closer to the bed, his expression still processing everything he had learned in the past few minutes. Diane remained standing by the door, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "My dearest Eleanor," I began reading aloud, "I chose your name to honor two remarkable women whose stories deserve to be remembered and celebrated. The first is your great-grandmother, Eleanor May Sanders, born in 1889 in a small mining town in Pennsylvania." I looked up at Mark, who was listening with complete attention. "Did you know that Eleanor May was widowed at 28 with 6 children under the age of 12? Her husband died in a mining accident, and instead of giving up, she taught herself to sew and started taking in piecework to support her family." "I never heard that story," Mark said quietly. "That's because it was easier to invent new traditions than preserve real ones," I replied, glancing at Diane before continuing to read. "Eleanor May worked 16-hour days for 15 years, saving every penny she could. She sent 3 of her children to college during the Great Depression, something almost unheard of for a single mother in those days. One of those children was your great-great-grandfather, Samuel, who became a teacher and helped dozens of other children get their educations." Diane had gone very quiet, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "The second woman you're named after," I continued, "is my grandmother, whose full name was Ana Esperanza Martinez before she married my grandfather. She came to America alone at 17, speaking no English, carrying nothing but a suitcase and an unshakable faith that she could build a better life for the family she hoped to have someday." My voice grew stronger as I read about my grandmother's story. Esperanza worked in a textile factory during the day and took English classes at night. She saved every dollar she could, sending money back to Mexico to help her younger siblings while also saving for her own future. When she met your great-grandfather, she had already bought a small house with her own wages, something almost impossible for a single woman in the 1940s. I folded the letter and looked directly at Diane. "These are the women I wanted my daughter to carry forward, women who faced real adversity and overcame it through strength, determination, and love for their families. Women whose stories were almost lost because no one thought to preserve them." "Those are beautiful stories," Mark said, and I could hear genuine emotion in his voice. "Why didn't I know about Eleanor May?" "Because your family's real history got buried under manufactured traditions and invented customs," I said gently. "Eleanor May's story didn't serve anyone's need for control, so it was forgotten. But Eleanor Esperanza will grow up knowing exactly who she was named after and why." Diane finally spoke, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "I never meant to erase anyone's history. I just wanted our family to have traditions, to have something special that connected us. But connection built on lies isn't real connection, Diane. It's just control disguised as love." I opened Eleanor's baby book to show the family trees I had carefully drawn, real family trees with dates and facts and stories that could be verified. Eleanor will grow up with this book. She'll know about Eleanor May's courage and Esperanza's determination. She'll also know about Helen, your mother, who worked as a bank secretary for 30 years and saved enough money to help you and David buy your first house. Diane's eyes widened. "You researched my mother too?" "I researched all of our family. Histories. Real histories with real accomplishments worth celebrating. Helen put herself through night school to become a bookkeeper when women rarely had career opportunities. That's a legacy worth passing down." Mark was looking at the baby book, reading the family stories I had compiled. "This is incredible, Jewell. Look at all these amazing women in our family Why did we never talk about them? Because it was easier to invent a simple tradition than to preserve complex truths, I said. But Eleanor deserves better. She deserves to know about the real heroes in her family tree. Diane sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, looking older than I had ever seen her. I never thought of it as lying, she said quietly. I thought I was creating something meaningful for the family. Meaning that comes from manipulation isn't actually meaningful, Diane. It's just another form of control. Eleanor stirred in my arms, making soft baby sounds. I looked down at her perfect little face and felt that fierce protective love surge through me again. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders, I said aloud, letting the name fill the room. Named after women who built legacies. Through their actions, not their demands. Named after courage and hope and the belief that the next generation deserves better than the previous one. Diane was quiet for a long moment, staring at her granddaughter. She's beautiful, she said finally. Yes, she is. And she's going to grow up knowing exactly who she is and where she comes from, the real stories, not the invented ones. Mark reached out to touch Eleanor's tiny hand. Eleanor Esperanza, he said softly. I like it. I like knowing the stories behind it. There are dozens more stories in that book, I said. Real stories about real people who face real challenges. Eleanor will never have to wonder about her heritage because it's all documented, the struggles and the triumphs, the ordinary heroes and the quiet strength that got passed down through generations. I looked at Diane again, seeing something in her expression that might have been the beginning of understanding. You could be part of that legacy, Diane. You could contribute real stories about real accomplishments instead of trying to control everyone else's narratives. What do you mean? I mean, Eleanor deserves to know about the grandmother who organized charity drives for 20 years, who volunteered at the church food bank, who helped 3 different families get back on their feet after job losses. Those are your real accomplishments, Diane. They don't need to be manufactured or exaggerated. They're already meaningful. For the first time since entering the room, Diane's expression softened genuinely. You researched my volunteer work, too. I researched everything, the good and the problematic. Eleanor will grow up with the whole truth, not carefully edited versions designed to serve someone else's agenda. The birth certificate still lay on the table between us, official proof that some battles, once won, cannot be refought. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders was no longer a possibility or a negotiation. She was a reality, documented in permanent ink, protected by law and by a mother's determination to break generational cycles of manipulation. What happens now? Diane asked, looking uncertain for perhaps the first time in the years I had known her. Now we decide what kind of family we want to be going forward, I said. One that honors real history or one that keeps fighting over invented traditions. One that respects boundaries or one that keeps trying to control outcomes. The choice is yours, Diane, but it won't affect Eleanor's name. That decision is final. The family photo album Diane brought out from her purse 2 hours after. Eleanor's birth felt like her final weapon at Potty May. Carefully curated collection of images that told the story she wanted to preserve rather than the truth I had just exposed. But I was ready for this battle too. I brought this to show Eleanor when she gets older, Diane said, setting the leather-bound album on the hospital table next to my documentation. Family photos are so important for children to understand where they come from. I recognized the manipulation immediately. After losing the naming battle, Diane was pivoting to visual narrative control, showing Eleanor only the images that supported her version of family history while omitting anything that contradicted it. That's thoughtful, I said carefully, but I've been putting together Eleanor's own photo collection, one that includes the whole family, not just carefully selected moments. Mark looked between his mother and me, still processing the revelations of the past few hours. The genealogy research had shaken him, but I could see him struggling with the implications. Accepting that his mother had lied about family traditions meant accepting that his entire understanding of his family might be flawed. What do you mean, carefully selected? He asked. I reached for my phone and pulled up some of the photos that Mark's Aunt Linda had sent me, images from family gatherings before. Diane had gained complete control of the family narrative. I mean photos like this one, I said, showing him a picture from his father's first wedding. Or this one from your cousin Jennifer's graduation party, the one where Jennifer looks happy and confident. Before your mother started her campaign to criticize Jennifer's life choices. Diane's face flushed. I never criticized Jennifer. I simply expressed concern about some of her decisions. You told her that her career in social work was admirable but impractical, that her apartment was too small for entertaining family, and that her boyfriend wasn't serious about commitment. I interrupted, reading from notes I had taken during my conversations with family members. Jennifer stopped attending family gatherings because she felt constantly judged. That's not true. It is true, Diane. I spoke to her, just like I spoke to your nephew, Paul, who moved to Oregon partly to escape the family dynamics you created. Just like I spoke to Sarah, who limits Emma's exposure to family events because of your criticism of her parenting choices. Mark was staring at me with something like shock. You talked to all of them? I talked to everyone I could reach. I wanted to understand the full pattern, not just my own experience. I opened my phone's photo gallery to show pictures I had collected from various family members. Look at these photos, Mark. Really look at them. The images told a story Diane's curated album never would. Photos from family gatherings where people looked tense and guarded. Pictures where Diane was positioned at the center of every group, directing poses and controlling the narrative even in candid moments. Images from events where family members looked like they were performing rather than celebrating. This is from Tom and Sarah's wedding, I said, showing a photo where Diane was clearly orchestrating the family group shot. Look at everyone's faces. Do they look happy to you? Or do they look like they're trying to avoid doing something wrong? Mark studied the image, and I could see recognition dawning in his expression. They looked nervous. Because they were nervous. Because family gatherings had become performances where everyone had to play their assigned roles in Diane's version of what a perfect family should look like. Diane snatched the phone from my hands. These photos are taken out of context. Every family has moments where people look tired or distracted. Every photo, Diane, at every gathering, for years. I took my phone back calmly. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it. I opened Eleanor's baby book again, showing Mark the section where I had included photos that told the real family story images, that showed both joy and struggle, both connection and conflict, both love and the hard work of maintaining relationships. Eleanor will grow up with honest documentation of her family, I said. Photos that show real emotions, real relationships, real history, not a sanitized version designed to protect someone else's ego. Diane's composure was cracking again, but this time her response was anger rather than confusion. I have spent 30 years trying to hold this family together, she said, her voice rising. I have organized every holiday, planned every celebration, maintained every tradition. You've controlled every narrative, I corrected. There's a difference between bringing people together and manipulating their behavior to serve your vision of what family should look like. That's enough, Mark said suddenly, his voice firmer than I had heard it in years. Mom, I need you to stop for a minute and really listen to what Jewell was saying. Diane turned to her son with an expression of betrayal. Mark, surely you don't believe. I'm starting to believe a lot of things I never questioned before, Mark said quietly. The genealogy research is pretty clear, Mom. The naming tradition really was made up. But even if it was, I was trying to create something meaningful by Lying to your son about his family heritage, I said firmly. By manipulating multiple family members over years. By driving away people who wouldn't conform to your vision of what they should be. Mark was looking at his mother with new eyes, and I could see the moment when he really understood what had been happening. Mom, is this why Jennifer stopped coming to family dinners? Is this why Paul moved across the country? Diane's silence was answer enough. And is this why David's first wife left? Mark continued, his voice growing stronger. Because you couldn't accept her either? That marriage had problems that had nothing to do with me. Carol Ann lasted 3 years before she filed for divorce, citing incompatible family relationships. I said, showing him the divorce records. 3 years of trying to fit into a family system where she would never be accepted because she threatened your control. The room fell silent except for Eleanor's soft breathing and the distant sounds of hospital activity in the hallway. Mark was staring at his mother like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in his life. How many people, Mom? He asked finally. How many people have you driven away from this family? Diane looked around the room as if searching for escape routes. I never drove anyone away. I simply maintained standards. You maintained control, Mark said, his voice sad but certain. And Jewell almost became another casualty, didn't she? I reached over and took his hand, feeling a shift in our relationship that had been building since Eleanor's birth. For the first time in years, we were truly on the same side. The good news, I said, looking at Diane directly, is that it doesn't have to continue. Eleanor can grow up in a family that values honesty over control, that celebrates real accomplishments over manufactured traditions, that welcomes people instead of testing them for compliance. But that's going to require some changes, Mark added, and I felt a surge of pride at his growing strength. Starting with accepting that Eleanor's name is final, and that Jewell and I make decisions about our daughter, not you, Mom. Diane's face went through a series of emotions, shock, anger, calculation, and finally something that might have been resignation. The battle for Eleanor's name had been the catalyst, but the war had always been about much more than what to call my daughter Dot. It had been about who would control our family's future. The woman who had spent decades manipulating narratives to serve her own needs, or the parents who were determined to break that cycle. Looking at Eleanor sleeping peacefully in my arms, I knew which side had won. Mark's grandmother's diary arrived by overnight delivery while we were still in the hospital, carried by Tom's wife, Sarah, who had driven 3 hours to be there for what she called the reckoning. The leather-bound journal had been in Sarah's possession since Grandma Betty Sanders passed away 6 months earlier, but she had been waiting for the right moment to share its contents. Daddy made me promise to give this to Mark when Diane tried to rewrite the family history again, Sarah explained, settling into the visitor's chair while Eleanor slept in my arms. She knew this day would come. Mark took the diary with reverent hands. His grandmother had been the family matriarch before Diane married into the Sanders clan, and her death had left a void that Diane had quickly moved to fill. Grandma Betty kept a diary? Mark asked, genuinely surprised. For 60 years, Sarah replied. And she was very clear about what she wanted people to know about this family's real history, including some things about your mother that might surprise you. The first entry Sarah directed us to was dated 1985, the year Mark was born. Diane is at it again, trying to convince everyone that her ideas are family traditions. Today she insisted that we need to start hanging stockings in birth order at Christmas because that's how the Sanders family has always done it. I've been a Sanders woman for 42 years, and we never had any such tradition. But David goes along with whatever she says to keep the peace. I worry about what kind of family Mark will grow up thinking he belongs to one based on real history or Diane's inventions. Mark's hands were shaking as he read his grandmother's careful handwriting. She knew. Grandma Betty knew what Mom was doing. Keep reading, Sarah said gently, The entries chronicled decades of Diane's behavior, her tendency to invent traditions that positioned her as the family authority, her systematic exclusion of people who didn't conform to her vision, and her increasing control over family narratives as older relatives passed away. Particular revealing entry from 1988 discussed the death of Mark's baby sister, little Amanda. Rose died last night. Linda is devastated, and David is trying to be strong for everyone. But I'm worried about Diane's reaction. She's been calling the baby little Diane since the day she was born, despite Linda's objections. Even in death, Diane wants to claim this child as her legacy. I told her today that Amanda Rose's name stays Amanda Rose on the headstone, and for once, David supported me. Some things are too sacred for Diane's games. Mark looked up from the diary, his face pale. She tried to rename my sister, even after she died. Your grandmother fought her on it, Sarah said quietly. Betty was the only person who could stand up to Diane in those days. But after Betty got sick, there was no one left to challenge her version of events. Another entry from 1995 revealed even more. David's first wife, Carol, called me today. She wanted me to know that she didn't leave because she didn't love David. She left because she couldn't survive in this family with Diane controlling everything. Carol said that every decision she made was wrong in Diane's eyes. Every tradition she suggested was not how the Sanders family does things. Every attempt to contribute was redirected or dismissed. I should have done more to protect her. But I didn't understand how systematic Diane's control had become until it was too late. My dad's first wife called Grandma Betty, Mark asked. Multiple times over the years, apparently. Betty felt guilty about not protecting her from Diane's manipulation. She didn't want the same thing to happen to other women who married into the family. I felt tears stinging my eyes as I realized that Mark's grandmother had been trying to protect me through her diary, documenting the pattern so that future generations would understand what had really happened. The most damning entry was from 2010. Diane announced at dinner tonight that she's decided. The Sanders family has always named first daughters after the paternal grandmother. This is complete fiction, I should know, since I've been the paternal grandmother for 30 years, and no one has ever been named Betty after me. When I pointed this out, Diane said that the tradition must have started with her generation. The audacity is breathtaking. She's literally inventing family customs in real time and expecting everyone to accept them as historical fact. Mark closed the diary and sat in silence for several minutes. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of profound sadness mixed with growing anger. She's been lying about our family history my entire life, he said quietly. Not just lying, Sarah corrected. Systematically erasing the real history and replacing it with her own version. Betty was terrified that the truth would die with her, so she documented everything. Diane had been noticeably absent from the hospital room for the past hour, claiming she needed to make some phone calls. But I suspected she was regrouping, preparing for her next offensive now that the naming battle had been lost. There's more, Sarah said, pulling out her phone. After you called yesterday to tell us about Eleanor's birth, I reached out to some of the family members who've been displaced over the years. They wanted you to know you're not alone in this. She showed us a group text thread that had been building since the previous evening. Messages from Jennifer, who was thrilled to hear that someone had finally stood up to Diane's manipulation. From Paul in Oregon, who offered to share his own documentation of Diane's behavior over the years. From Mark's cousin Rebecca, who revealed that she had stopped attending family gatherings because Diane consistently criticized her children's behavior. There's a whole network of family members who've been pushed to the margins, Sarah explained. People who love this family but couldn't survive Diane's need to control everything. Mark was reading the messages, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. I had no idea. I thought these people just drifted away naturally. They were pushed away systematically, I said gently. Just like Carol Ann was pushed away, just like I almost was. Diane has been curating this family for decades, keeping the people who would go along with her narrative and discarding the ones who wouldn't. Eleanor stirred in my arms, making soft baby sounds. I looked down at her perfect little face and felt that fierce protective love surge through me again. But it stops with Eleanor, I said firmly. She's going to grow up knowing the real family. History surrounded by people who love her for who she is, not who they want her to be. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving. Betty would have loved that. She always said that the truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. Mark reached for the diary again, turning to a page Sarah had bookmarked. What's this one? Your grandmother's instructions for what to do when Diane inevitably tried to control the next generation, Sarah said. She was very specific about the steps to take. The entry was dated just 2 months before Betty's death. If Diane tries her naming games with Mark's children, the family needs to be ready with the truth. I've asked Sarah to keep this diary and share it when the time comes. The genealogy records are in my safe deposit box. Sarah has the key. The family needs to know that love doesn't require compliance, and that real traditions are built on truth, not manipulation. Whoever is brave enough to stand up to Diane will need support, because she won't give up control easily. But they shouldn't have to fight this battle alone. I felt like Mark's grandmother was reaching across time to support me in this moment, to validate my decision to protect Eleanor from inheriting a legacy of manipulation and control. We don't have to fight this alone, Mark said, reading my thoughts. Grandma Betty made sure of that. The door opened and Diane returned, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of forced smile that meant she had decided on her next strategy. But when she saw the diary in Mark's hands and Sarah sitting beside us, her expression flickered with something that looked like fear. What's that? She asked, trying to sound casual. Grandma Betty's diary, Mark said simply. Sarah brought it for her. Used to read. The color drained from Diane's face. After 30 years of controlling the family narrative, she was finally facing the one person who had been documenting her behavior all along. Someone whose credibility she couldn't undermine, whose memory she couldn't revise. The truth, as Betty had predicted, had a way of surviving. The marriage certificate Mark pulled from his wallet that evening felt like a talisman, a reminder of vows we had made to each other before his mother's. Manipulation had nearly destroyed our partnership. He held it carefully, reading the words. That had united us 5 years earlier, his expression thoughtful and sad. I promise to honor and protect you, he said quietly, Eleanor sleeping peacefully in the hospital bassinet beside us. But I've been protecting my mother's feelings instead of my wife's well-being. I can see that now. The confrontation with Diane had continued for hours after Sarah arrived with his grandmother's diary. Faced with decades of documented evidence of her manipulation, Diane had cycled through every defense mechanism in her arsenal: denial, anger, victimization, and finally a kind of desperate bargaining where she offered to compromise on Eleanor's name if we would just forget about all this unpleasantness. But Mark had finally seen the pattern clearly, and there was no unseeing it. When did it start? He asked, still studying the marriage certificate. When did I stop being your husband and start being her son first? It was a painful question, but an important one. I think it started during our engagement, I said honestly. Every time there was a conflict between what you and I wanted and what your mother expected, you chose her expectations. The wedding planning, the apartment decorating, the holiday traditions, I lost a little bit of myself each time, and you let it happen. Mark winced, but didn't argue. I told myself I was keeping the peace, that family harmony was more important than individual preferences. But it was never about family harmony, Mark. It was about your mother's need to control every situation. And the cost of her harmony was my voice, my traditions, my sense of belonging in our own marriage. He set the marriage certificate on the hospital table next to Eleanor's birth certificate, two documents that represented different chapters of our relationship. The marriage certificate from when we had been full of hope and compromise. The birth certificate from when I had finally found the strength to draw unbreachable boundaries. I failed you, he said simply. For years, I failed you. And I almost let her do to Eleanor what she did to you. The admission was devastating and liberating at the same time. For years, I had questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or unreasonable. Having Mark finally acknowledge the reality of what had been happening felt like being handed back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. What changed? I asked. What made you finally see it? Mark looked at Eleanor, sleeping peacefully, despite the upheaval around her, watching you protect her. Seeing the strength it took to research our family history, to document all of Diane's lies, to prepare for this confrontation. You did all of that alone because I wasn't supporting you, but you did it anyway because you love our daughter more than you fear conflict. He paused, his voice growing stronger, and reading Grandma Betty's diary, seeing that she had been trying to warn us for years, that she understood what Diane was doing and felt powerless to stop it. I realized that if I didn't change, Eleanor would grow up watching her mother shrink the same way you've been shrinking, and I couldn't let that happen. The transformation in Mark over the past 12 hours had been remarkable. For the first time since I had known him, he was questioning his mother's authority instead of automatically deferring to it. When Diane had tried to guilt him about choosing his wife over his mother, he had responded firmly that he was choosing. Truth over manipulation. What happens when we go home? I asked. Diane isn't going to accept this quietly. She's been controlling your family narrative for 30 years. She's not going to give up that power easily. Mark was quiet for a long moment, looking back and forth between our marriage certificate and Eleanor's birth certificate, between who we had been and who we needed to become. We set boundaries, he said finally. Clear, firm boundaries about her role in our lives and Eleanor's life. No more unannounced visits. No more taking over our decisions. No more rewriting history to serve her ego. And if she can't accept those boundaries, then she'll have limited access to our family until she can accept them. Eleanor's well-being comes first, our marriage comes second, and my mother's feelings come third. That's how it should have been from the beginning. It was exactly what I had needed to hear for years, that Mark understood the hierarchy of loyalties that should guide our family decisions. But I also knew that implementing those boundaries would be harder than stating them. She's going to test every boundary we set, I warned. She's going to try to manipulate you through guilt, through family pressure, through making herself the victim of our unreasonable demands. I know, but I have tools now that I didn't have before. He gestured toward his grandmother's diary and the genealogy research I had compiled. I have documentation of the patterns. I have evidence of the lies. And most importantly, I have a clear understanding of what's at stake if I don't change. He looked at Eleanor again, his expression fierce with protective love. I won't let her do to Eleanor what she did to you. I won't let her drive away our daughter the way she drove away Jennifer and Paul and Rebecca and God knows how many other family members over the years. It's going to be hard, Mark. Your mother is going to make it as difficult as possible. Then we'll face the difficulty together as partners, the way we should have been doing all along. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. I'm not the husband you married, Jewell. That man was too afraid of conflict to protect his wife from systematic manipulation. But I'm not that man anymore. Eleanor changed me. Watching you fight for her changed me. I understand now what being a husband and father really means. The marriage certificate on the table seemed to take on new meaning, not just as a record of legal union, but as a promise that could be renewed and strengthened by hard-won wisdom. We had been married for 5 years, but in some ways, our real partnership was just beginning. What do we tell Eleanor when she's old enough to understand? I asked. We tell her the truth. That her grandmother struggled with controlling behavior that hurt people she loved. That her parents learned to set healthy boundaries to protect their family. That love sometimes requires difficult conversations and firm limits. He picked up Eleanor's birth certificate again, reading her full name aloud. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders. Named after women who faced adversity with courage and built better lives for their families. That's the legacy we're passing on to her, not compliance and people-pleasing, but strength and authenticity and the belief that she deserves to be loved for exactly who she is. The hospital room felt different now, not like a battlefield, but like a birthplace. The place where Eleanor had entered the world, where I had found my voice again, and where Mark had finally learned what it meant to be a protector rather than a peacekeeper. Our marriage had survived its greatest test, not by avoiding conflict, but by facing it together with truth as our weapon and love as our motivation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would meet them as true partners, united in our commitment to break generational cycles and build something healthier for our daughter. The medical records from my 6-week postpartum checkup told a story that numbers couldn't lie about: elevated blood pressure, signs of chronic stress, and weight loss that indicated I hadn't been eating properly despite breastfeeding. Dr. Martinez reviewed the charts with concern, asking gentle questions about my support system and emotional well-being. New motherhood is challenging under the best circumstances, she said, but these indicators suggest you're dealing with significant stressors beyond normal postpartum adjustment. She was right. The 6 weeks since Eleanor's birth had been a sustained campaign of psychological warfare, with Diane testing every boundary Mark and I had attempted to establish. The battle for Eleanor's name had been won, but the war for our family's autonomy was far from overdone. It started with the phone calls, multiple times per day, always with some urgent reason why Diane needed to speak with us immediately. When we stopped answering every call, she began showing up at our apartment unannounced, claiming she had been in the neighborhood and just wanted to check on little Eleanor. "You look tired, dear," she would say to me, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are you sure you're managing the baby properly? I could take her for a few hours so you could rest." When I declined her offers to take Eleanor, she would pivot to questioning my methods. Was I feeding her enough? Was she gaining weight appropriately? Did I think that crying was normal? Each question was designed to plant seeds of doubt about my competence as a mother. Mark had initially tried to moderate these interactions, suggesting compromises that might satisfy his mother while protecting our boundaries. But Diane interpreted any compromise as weakness, pushing harder each time she gained an inch. The turning point came when she arrived during Eleanor's nap time, letting herself in with the key Mark had given her years earlier, a key I hadn't realized she still possessed. "Oh good, she's sleeping," Diane whispered, moving toward Eleanor's crib. "I'll just hold her for a minute while she's peaceful." "Please don't wake her," I said firmly. "She just went down and she needs her full nap. I'm not going to wake her, Jewell. I know how to hold babies. I raised 2 sons, remember?" But as she reached for Eleanor, my daughter stirred and began to fuss. The protective instinct that had been building for weeks suddenly erupted. "Stop," I said, positioning myself between Diane and the crib. "You're not taking my daughter." "Don't be ridiculous. I'm her grandmother. You're a grandmother who refuses to respect boundaries, who manipulates situations to serve your own needs, and who has spent 6 weeks trying to undermine my confidence as a mother. You don't get unsupervised access to my child." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything in my previous experience with Diane, without Mark present to moderate, without social expectations to soften the edges. We finally had the direct conflict that had been building for years. "You were keeping me from my granddaughter," Diane said, her voice cold with fury. "This is emotional abuse, Jewell. You're using that baby to punish me for caring about family traditions. I'm protecting my daughter from inheriting a legacy of manipulation and control. You've spent decades driving people away from this family, and I won't let you do the same to Eleanor." "I have never driven anyone away. Jennifer stopped attending family gatherings because of your constant criticism. Paul moved across the country to escape your judgment. Your own daughter-in-law, Sarah, limits Emma's exposure to family events because she doesn't trust your influence. Carol Ann left her marriage partly because you made her life unbearable. How many more people need to flee before you admit there's a pattern?" Diane's facade of grandmotherly concern finally cracked completely. "Those people left because they couldn't handle being part of a real family with real standards. I maintain traditions and values that hold families together. You maintain control through manufactured traditions and psychological manipulation. There's a difference." The argument escalated until neighbors could probably hear us through the walls. When Mark arrived home from work to find his mother and wife in full confrontation, with Eleanor crying from being startled awake, he finally understood that moderation and compromise were not going to resolve the situation. "Mom, you need to leave," he said, his voice calm but absolute. "Now, Mark, surely you don't support this?" "I support my wife protecting our daughter from behavior that's been damaging this family for decades." "Give me your key to our apartment." The shock on Diane's face was profound. For 30 years, she had never been asked to leave a family space, never been denied access to family members, never faced consequences for her manipulative behavior. "You're choosing her over your own mother," she said, playing her final card. "I'm choosing healthy boundaries over toxic patterns," Mark replied. "The key, Mom." After Diane left, Mark called a locksmith. We changed the locks that same day and established a new rule. No unannounced visits, no assumption of access, no undermining of parenting decisions. But Diane's campaign continued through other channels. She called Mark's father, his brother, Tom, and various extended family members, attempting to rally support for her position as the wrongfully excluded grandmother. Some family members bought into her narrative of victimization, but others, armed with the truth from Grandma Betty's diary and their own experiences, supported our decision to set boundaries. The stress of managing this extended conflict while caring for a newborn was devastating. I found myself constantly vigilant, jumping at every phone ring, checking the locks multiple times per day, second-guessing my own parenting decisions because Diane's criticisms had gotten under my skin. Dr. Martinez's concern about my medical indicators was warranted. The chronic stress was affecting my physical health, my ability to bond with Eleanor, and my recovery from childbirth. "You might benefit from counseling," she suggested gently. "Both individual therapy to process the family conflict and couples, counseling to strengthen your partnership as you navigate these challenges." "The medical records don't lie," I told Mark that evening, showing him the concerning indicators from my checkup. "This level of conflict is literally making me sick." Mark looked at the charts with the same expression he'd had when reading his grandmother's diary recognition mixed with regret. "We need to end this," he said firmly. "Not by giving in to her demands, but by making it clear that there will be consequences for continued harassment." "What kind of consequences?" "No contact until she can demonstrate that she's ready to respect our boundaries. No visits, no phone calls, no attempts to manipulate other family members into pressuring us. Complete separation until she's ready to have a healthy relationship with our family." It was a drastic step, But the medical evidence made it clear that half measures weren't protecting Eleanor, preserving my health. The extended battle had to end, one way or another. The question was whether Diane would choose her need for control over her relationship with her granddaughter. Based on 30 years of documented behavior, the answer wasn't encouraging, but for the first time since Eleanor's birth, I felt like Mark and I were truly united in protecting our family's well-being, whatever the cost. The no-contact letter Mark drafted was 3 pages long, meticulously documented and emotionally devastating in its clinical precision. He had spent weeks researching the language used in family therapy resources, consulting with a counselor about healthy boundary setting, and carefully documenting every incident that had led to this drastic decision. "Dear Mom," it began, and I could see how much it cost him to write those words. After extensive consideration and consultation with family therapists, Jewell and I have decided that we need a complete break from contact with you until you can demonstrate genuine change in your behavior patterns. The letter outlined specific examples: the fabricated naming tradition, the manipulation of family members over decades, the violation of our parental authority, the refusal to respect boundaries around Eleanor's care, and the campaign of harassment that had followed our attempts to establish limits. "This is not a punishment," Mark continued in the letter. "This is a necessary step to protect our family's well-being, and to give you the opportunity to reflect on behavior patterns that have been damaging relationships for years. We are willing to rebuild our relationship when you can demonstrate genuine respect for our autonomy as parents and our authority over decisions regarding our daughter." The letter concluded with specific requirements for any future contact: acknowledgement of the documented behavior patterns, acceptance of responsibility without excuses or blame shifting, completion of family therapy focused on controlling behaviors, and demonstration of changed behavior over a sustained period. "Are you sure about this?" I asked as Mark sealed the envelope. Eleanor was sleeping in her bouncy seat beside us, peaceful and oblivious to the family upheaval surrounding her first months of life. "I'm sure," Mark said, though his hands were shaking slightly. "The medical evidence from your checkup made it clear that half measures aren't protecting our family. And after reading Grandma Betty's diary, I understand that this pattern has been going on for decades. If we don't stop it now, Eleanor will grow up thinking this level of manipulation is normal." We delivered the letter together, leaving it in Diane's mailbox rather than risking a confrontation that might escalate beyond our control. Then we returned home and waited for the inevitable response. It came within hours, not from Diane directly, but from Mark's father, David, calling to express his confusion and concern about the misunderstanding that had led to such a drastic decision. "Son, your mother is devastated," David said. "She's been crying for hours. She says you're keeping Eleanor away from her because of some disagreement about family traditions." "Dad, it's not about disagreements," Mark replied, putting the call on speaker so I could participate. "It's about documented patterns of manipulation and control that have been going on for years." "Did you read Grandma Betty's diary entries that Sarah shared with the family?" There was a long pause. "I read some of them, but Mark, you have to understand your grandmother was elderly, sometimes confused about details. The genealogy records confirm everything she wrote." "Dad, the naming tradition Mom claimed existed never existed. She made it up to control Jewell's decision about Eleanor's name." Another pause, longer this time. "Even if that's true, cutting off all contact seems extreme. Can't you work this out through discussion?" "We tried discussion for months," I interjected. "We tried boundaries, compromise, and mediation. Your wife responded by escalating her harassment, questioning my competence as a mother, and attempting to manipulate other family members into pressuring us. The stress was literally making me sick." Mark added, "Dad, I need you to understand that this isn't about punishing Mom. It's about protecting Eleanor from inheriting a legacy of manipulation and control." We're willing to rebuild the relationship if Mom can demonstrate genuine change, but that requires her to acknowledge the problem and work on fixing it. David's response revealed the depth of the family's dysfunction, but she's just being a concerned grandmother. Maybe she gets a little pushy sometimes, but that's just because she cares so much. Pushy was David's way of minimizing behavior that had driven away multiple family members over decades. His inability to see the pattern, even when confronted with documented evidence, explained how Diane had maintained her control for so long. The phone campaign continued for weeks. Tom called to express concern about family unity. Various cousins and extended family members reached out to suggest that we were overreacting or being too harsh on a woman who just wanted to be involved in her granddaughter's life. But there were also surprising sources of support. Jennifer called to express relief that someone had finally called out Diane's behavior. Paul sent a long email detailing his own experiences with Diane's manipulation and praising her courage in setting boundaries. Rebecca offered to testify about Diane's treatment of her own children if we ever needed additional documentation. The most powerful support came from Carol, and David's first wife, whom I had tracked down through social media. She called one evening while I was feeding Eleanor, her voice shaking with emotion. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "For 30 years, I've wondered if I was crazy for leaving David because of his mother's behavior. Reading about your situation, seeing that the same patterns continued with you, it validates everything I experienced. You're protecting your daughter from something I couldn't protect myself from." "What was it like?" I asked, living with Diane's control. "Suffocating," Carol Ann replied immediately. Every decision had to be approved by her. Every tradition had to conform to her vision. Every aspect of my relationship with David was subject to her oversight and criticism. I lost myself completely trying to become the daughter-in-law she wanted, and it still wasn't enough. "Do you regret leaving?" Never. Leaving David was the hardest thing I ever did, but it saved my sanity, and probably my life. I went on to marry a wonderful man whose mother welcomed me as a daughter, not a threat to be managed. The contrast showed me how abnormal Diane's behavior really was. Her validation strengthened my resolve during moments when family pressure made me question our decision. This wasn't normal grandmother behavior. This wasn't acceptable family dynamics. This was a pattern of control that had damaged relationships for decades. 3 months after we implemented no contact, Diane made one final attempt to regain access to Eleanor. She showed up at our apartment building, waiting in the lobby until other residents let her into the building, then knocking on our door while crying loudly enough for neighbors to hear. "Please let me see my granddaughter," she sobbed through the door. "I'm sorry for whatever I did wrong. I just want to hold Eleanor." But when Mark opened the door to speak with her, her demeanor changed immediately from grieving grandmother to calculating manipulator. "I've been talking to a lawyer," she announced. "In the state, grandparents have rights to visitation. You can't keep me away from Eleanor indefinitely." "Actually, we can," Mark replied calmly. "Grandparent visitation. Rights only apply when there's been an existing relationship that's in the child's best interest to maintain. Eleanor is 4 months old, and you've never had unsupervised access to her. More importantly, we have extensive documentation of behavior that courts would consider detrimental to a child's well-being." Diane's face went pale as she realized that we had done our legal research thoroughly. Her threat of legal action was empty, and we all knew it. That was the last time we saw or heard from Diane directly. The no-contact boundaries held, protected by changed logs, blocked phone numbers, and a clear understanding between Mark and me that Eleanor's well-being took precedence over all other considerations. The consequences of our decision rippled through the extended family for months. Some relationships were damaged by our refusal to pretend that Diane's behavior was acceptable. The other relationships grew stronger as family members felt safe to share their own experiences and validate each other's perceptions. Most importantly, Eleanor thrived in the peaceful environment we had created. Without Diane's constant criticism and boundary violations, I was able to bond with my daughter, recover from childbirth, and rediscover my own voice as a mother and wife. The resolution wasn't the reconciliation that fairy tales would have prescribed, but it was the protection that real life required, a clear demonstration that love without respect is not love at all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that behavior comes from family. Eleanor's first photo album became a testament to the healing that was possible when manipulation was replaced with authenticity. Unlike the carefully curated collections Diane had always assembled, this album told the real story of our families. First year together, the messy moments alongside the milestones, the struggles alongside the celebrations, the honest documentation of people learning to love each other without conditions or control. The first few months after implementing no contact with Diane were challenging in unexpected ways. Without the constant drama and crisis management, Mark and I had to learn how to relate to each other as partners rather than allies in a war. The habits we had developed, the hypervigilance, the defensive postures, the assumption that every family interaction was a potential battlefield took time to unlearn. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, I confided to Mark one evening as we watched Eleanor playing on her activity mat. She was 6 months old, sitting up on her own, babbling constantly, and developing a personality that was clearly her own rather than anyone else's projection. "I know what you mean," Mark replied. "For months, I've been braced for the next crisis, the next manipulation, the next test of our boundaries. It's strange to just exist as a family without having to defend our decisions constantly." We started couples counseling to help process the trauma of the previous years and rebuild our marriage on healthier foundations. Dr. Chun, our therapist, helped us understand how Mark's upbringing in a manipulative family system had affected his ability to recognize and respond to unhealthy dynamics. Children who grow up with manipulative parents often develop a kind of emotional blindness, she explained. They learn to normalize abnormal behavior because their survival depended on adapting to their parents' emotional needs rather than having their own needs recognized and met. Mark struggled with guilt about the years he had failed to protect me from his mother's behavior. "I keep thinking about all the times I could have stood up for you and didn't," he said during one session. "All the times I chose my mother's comfort over your well-being." Growth requires acknowledging past mistakes without being paralyzed by them, Dr. Chun replied. "The question isn't whether you made errors in judgment, clearly you did. The question is what you're doing now to ensure those patterns don't continue." What Mark was doing was remarkable. He had thrown himself into learning about healthy family dynamics with the same intensity he had once applied to avoiding conflict with his mother. He read books about boundary setting, emotional manipulation, and breaking generational cycles. He attended a support group for adult children of manipulative parents. Most importantly, he consistently chose our family's well-being over his mother's emotional demands. Meanwhile, I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been suppressed for years. Without Diane's constant criticism of my parenting choices, I developed confidence in my maternal instincts. Without the pressure to conform to her vision of family traditions, Mark and I created our own customs that reflected our values and Eleanor's personality. We started having friends over for dinner, something I had rarely done during the years. When Diane might show up unannounced and take over the conversation, we traveled to visit my extended family, introducing Eleanor to her great-aunts and cousins who had stories to tell about my grandmother, Esperanza. We celebrated holidays in ways that felt meaningful to us rather than obligatory. The photo album captured these authentic moments, Eleanor's first Christmas, where she was more interested in the wrapping paper than the gifts. Her first Easter spent at a picnic in the park rather than a formal family dinner. Her first Halloween dressed as a tiny pumpkin because it made us laugh, not because it looked impressive in photos. One of the most healing experiences was connecting with other family members who had been pushed to the margins by Diane's need for control. Jennifer started visiting regularly, sharing stories about her work as a social worker and her perspective on family dynamics that had been shaped by her own experience with Diane's manipulation. You know what's funny? Jennifer said during one visit, watching Eleanor toddle around our living room, I always thought I was the problem in our family. I thought I was just too sensitive, too rebellious, too unwilling to appreciate family traditions. But watching Eleanor grow up in this peaceful environment, seeing how confident and secure she is, it makes me realize that the problem was never us. The problem was the system we were trying to survive in. Paul visited from Oregon for Eleanor's first birthday, bringing photo albums from his own childhood that told stories Diane had never shared with the rest of the family. There were pictures of family gatherings before Diane had gained complete control, images where people looked relaxed and genuinely happy instead of performing for someone else's vision of family perfection. Look at this one, Paul said, showing. It was a photo from David's wedding to Mark's mother, Linda. Look at how tense everyone looks. Even at their own wedding, people were worried about doing something wrong, saying something that would upset Diane. The contrast with Eleanor's first birthday party was stark. Our celebration was small, just Mark and me, Sarah and Tom with their daughter Emma, Jennifer, Paul, and a few close friends who had become our chosen family. Eleanor sat in her high chair, happily smashing cake with her hands while everyone laughed and took pictures with no pressure to capture the perfect moment. This is what family should feel like, Sarah observed, watching Eleanor giggle as she discovered that cake could be both eaten and painted with. Relaxed, loving, authentic, no performance required. Rebuilding our marriage proved to be both challenging and rewarding. Mark had to learn how to be a partner rather than a mediator, how to support me without assuming I needed protection from conflict. I had to learn how to trust his support after years of feeling like I was fighting battles alone. I spent so many years trying to keep everyone happy, Mark reflected one evening as we looked through Eleanor's photo album together. But everyone really meant my mother. I was so focused on managing her emotions that I forgot my primary responsibility was to you and Eleanor. You were doing the best you could, I replied. You were raised in a system where love was conditional, on compliance. It takes time to unlearn those patterns. But I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you from years of that manipulation. Maybe, but we're here now, and Eleanor is growing up in a completely different environment. That's what matters. The most profound healing came from watching Eleanor develop her own personality without anyone trying to shape her into a predetermined mold. At 10 months old, she was curious, determined, and delightfully stubborn traits that Diane would have tried to correct, but that we celebrated as signs of Eleanor's strong will and independence. She knows exactly what she wants, Mark marveled one day as Eleanor repeatedly threw her toys off her high chair tray, laughing each time we picked them up. And she's not afraid to ask for it. That's because she's never been told that her wants don't matter, I replied. She's never been taught to suppress her personality to make someone else comfortable. The photo album documented these small victories, Eleanor's first steps, taken at her own pace without anyone pushing her to walk before she was ready. Her first words, mama, dada, and surprisingly, no, spoken with clear intent and no apologies. Her first attempts at independence, messily feeding herself because we valued her autonomy more than our kitchen's cleanliness. By Eleanor's first birthday, our family had found its rhythm. We had movie nights where Eleanor would fall asleep between. US on the couch. We had lazy Sunday mornings where no one had to be anywhere or perform for anyone. We had conversations about the future that were based on our dreams rather than someone else's expectations. I never knew family life could be this peaceful, Mark admitted one evening as we watched Eleanor sleep in her crib, her tiny hands curled into fists, her breathing steady and content. It can be when everyone's emotional needs are considered. Equal, I replied. When adults take responsibility for their own emotions instead of expecting children or other adults to manage them, the healing wasn't complete and probably never would be. We still jumped when the phone rang unexpectedly, still felt anxious during family gatherings with extended relatives, still caught ourselves over-explaining decisions that were really none of anyone else's business. But we were building something new, a family culture based on respect, authenticity, and unconditional love. Eleanor's photo album captured that growth, page by page, month by month. Not the sanitized perfection that Diane would have demanded, but the real beauty of people learning to love each other without conditions, control, or manufactured drama. It was exactly the legacy we wanted to pass on to our daughter, the knowledge that she was loved for who she was, not who anyone else wanted her to be. Eleanor's birth story journal sits on my nightstand now, a leather-bound book where I've been recording not just the facts of her arrival, but the deeper story of how her birth transformed our entire family. Tonight, as she celebrates her first birthday with kid-covered hands and infectious giggles, I'm writing the final entry, a letter for her to read someday, when she's old enough to understand why her name matters so much. My dearest Eleanor, I write, today you turned 1 year old, and I want you to know that your first year on this earth has been the most transformative period of my life. Not just because you made me a mother, but because loving you taught me what it means to protect something precious from forces that would try to diminish it. The past year has been a masterclass in boundary setting, authenticity, and the difference between peace and mere absence of conflict. Our family has found its center in ways I never thought possible during those dark years when I was shrinking to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. Mark and I renewed our wedding vows on Eleanor's first birthday, not in a formal ceremony, but in a quiet conversation in our living room after she went to sleep. We acknowledged the years when we had lost our way, when external pressures had nearly destroyed our partnership, and we recommitted to putting our nuclear family first in all future decisions. I promise to see you, Mark said, holding my hands, in the dim light of Eleanor's nightlight. Really see you, not the version of you that makes other people comfortable. I promise to support your voice, especially when it's saying things that are hard for others to hear. I promise to trust your growth, I replied, to remember that people can change when they're willing to do the work, and to not punish you forever for mistakes you've already learned from. Our extended family looks different now. Some relationships were casualties of our decision to prioritize authenticity over artificial harmony. Mark's father, David, still struggles to understand why we can't just forgive and forget Diane's behavior. Some cousins and extended family members have distanced themselves, uncomfortable with our refusal to pretend that manipulation is love, but other relationships have grown stronger and more meaningful. Sarah and Tom visit regularly now, no longer. Walking on eggshells around family dynamics, their daughter Emma and Eleanor are developing a genuine cousin bond, playing together without adults hovering to ensure their interactions meet someone else's standards for appropriate family behavior. Jennifer has become like a sister to me, sharing insights from her professional training as a social worker that help me understand family systems and emotional health. Paul sends photos from his life and Oregon pictures of hiking trips and community celebrations that show what freedom looks like when you're not constantly managing someone else's emotional needs. Most surprisingly, we've heard from others who escaped similar family dynamics. Carol Ann, David's first wife, has become a source of wisdom and validation. She shares strategies for healing from psychological manipulation and reminds me regularly that our decision to protect Eleanor was not only justified but necessary. Generational cycles is one of the most loving things a parent can do, she told me recently. Eleanor will never know the particular pain of having her personality constantly criticized and adjusted. That's a gift you've given her that she won't fully understand until she's an adult, but it will shape every relationship she ever has. The impact on Eleanor herself has been profound. At 1 year old, she is confident, curious, and securely attached. She explores her world without constant anxiety about approval. She expresses her needs clearly and trusts that they will be met with respect rather than judgment. She has never learned to make herself small to accommodate someone else's ego. She's going to be formidable, Jennifer observed during today's birthday celebration. Watching Eleanor determinedly work on opening a gift despite our offers to help. She knows her own mind and isn't afraid to insist on it. That's exactly what we hoped for, Mark replied. And I could hear the pride in his voice, not pride in Eleanor's compliance or performance, but pride in her authentic self-expression. The journal I'm keeping for Eleanor contains more than just the story of her birth and first year. It includes copies of the genealogy research that revealed the truth about our family history, documentation of the boundary-setting process that protected her from inheriting toxic patterns, photos and letters from family members who chose authenticity over artificial harmony, but most importantly, it contains the ongoing story of what it looks like to build a family culture based on love without conditions, respect without control, and tradition without manipulation. Someday you might ask why your grandmother Diane isn't part of your life, I write in tonight's journal entry. The answer is that sometimes people we love make choices that put their need for control above their love for family members. When that happens, the loving thing to do is to protect yourself and the people you're responsible for, even when that protection requires difficult boundaries. You are named after women who faced adversity with courage and built better lives for their families. Eleanor May Sanders raised 6 children alone during the Depression. Esperanza Martinez came to America with nothing but hope and determination. These women didn't just survive difficult circumstances, they transformed them into opportunities for growth and change. That's your inheritance, my sweet girl. Not compliance or people-pleasing, but the courage to be authentically yourself. And the wisdom to surround yourself with people who celebrate that authenticity rather than trying to diminish it. The house is quiet now, except for Eleanor's peaceful breathing through the baby monitor. Mark is reading beside me, occasionally looking up to share something interesting from his book about child development. This is what contentment feels like, not the absence of challenges, but the presence of people who face those challenges together with honesty and mutual support. Tomorrow marks the beginning of Eleanor's 2nd year, and our family's continued journey toward health and authenticity. There will be new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new moments when we'll need to choose between what's easy and what's right. But tonight, I'm confident that we'll make those choices from a place of strength rather than fear, wisdom rather than trauma, love rather than obligation. Eleanor will grow up knowing that she is valued for exactly who she is, that her voice matters, and that real love never requires her to become smaller to make someone else more comfortable. That knowledge, documented in this journal and lived out in our daily interactions, is the greatest gift we can give her, the foundation for a life built on authenticity rather than performance, connection rather than control, and the unshakable belief that she deserves to be loved completely and unconditionally. Certificate that started this whole battle still sits in Eleanor's baby book, but it's no longer a weapon or a symbol of conflict. It's simply a document that records the truth. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders, daughter of parents who loved her enough to fight for her right to be herself, named after women whose stories were worth preserving and passing forward. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when they're fought not for victory over others, but for the protection of something precious and irreplaceable. Eleanor's name, her story, and her future were worth every difficult conversation, every set boundary, and every relationship that couldn't survive our insistence on authenticity. In the end, that's what real love looks like, not the willingness to keep peace at any cost, but the courage to protect what matters most, even when that protection requires saying no to people we care about. Eleanor Esperanza Sanders, beloved daughter, bearer of family history, and proof that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to pass trauma to the next generation.